The wind cut through the canvas walls like a blade, cold and sharp, carrying with it the distant rumble of artillery. It was the early hours of January 3rd, 1945, somewhere near the snow-covered outskirts of Bastogne. The sky was still dark, but the war never slept. Inside a dimly lit command tent, General George S. Patton stood over a wooden table, his gloved hands pressed firmly against a map scattered with pins and markings. The Third Army had just turned the tide in the Ardennes.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
But something was wrong. Very wrong. Reports were not lining up. Movements were being anticipated. Orders were somehow known before they were even carried out. And Patton, a man who trusted instinct as much as strategy, felt it deep in his bones. There was a traitor, not out there in the snow, but inside his own ranks. You can almost feel the tension in that moment, the kind that doesn't come from enemy fire, but from uncertainty, from the idea that someone close, someone trusted, might be feeding the enemy information. Patton didn't panic. He never did. But his mind began working fast. This was not just a breach. This was a threat that could destroy everything they had fought for. The Battle of the Bulge had begun on December 16th, 1944. German forces launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. It was one of Hitler's last desperate attempts to split Allied forces and push toward Antwerp. At first, the Americans were caught off guard. But within days, Patton had done something few thought possible. He pivoted his entire Third Army north, redirecting thousands of men, vehicles, and supplies in the middle of winter. By December 26th, his forces broke through to relieve the surrounded troops in Bastogne. But even as the situation improved on the surface, strange patterns began to emerge. German units seemed to anticipate supply routes. Artillery strikes landed dangerously close to newly established positions. Patrols reported ambushes in places that were supposed to be secure. At first, it could be dismissed as coincidence. War is chaos, after all, but Patton didn't believe in coincidence when lives were at stake. He called in his intelligence officers. Colonel Oscar Koch, his trusted G2, was among the first. Koch had been with Patton long enough to understand how seriously he took these anomalies. They spread reports across the table, dates, locations, intercepted communications. There was a pattern, not obvious at first glance, but there if you looked closely enough. The Germans weren't guessing. They were being told. Patton's jaw tightened. This meant only one thing. Someone inside the American command structure was leaking information, and not just any information, operational details, movements, timing, the kind of intelligence that could only come from someone with access. The investigation began quietly. There would be no public accusations, no panic among the troops. Patton knew that morale was just as important as firepower. If soldiers started believing that someone among them was a traitor, trust would collapse. And without trust, an army falls apart. So the hunt became silent, controlled, precise. They started by narrowing access. Who had knowledge of the most sensitive operations? Staff officers, signal corps, liaison units. Anyone who handled communications between divisions. The list wasn't short, but it wasn't endless either. Patton ordered that certain operational details be altered slightly before being passed along different channels. Small changes, a different route here, a delayed timing there. Nothing that would affect the mission too much, but enough to track where information might be leaking. It was a dangerous game. If the wrong information reached the wrong ears, men could die. But Patton understood that allowing a traitor to operate freely was far more dangerous. Days passed. Snow continued to fall. The front line shifted slowly as Allied forces pushed back. And then it happened. A German artillery strike hit a supply convoy that had been rerouted at the last minute. Only one group had been informed of that specific route. The information had not gone through standard channels. It was a controlled test. And now the result was clear. The leak was coming from within that circle. The focus narrowed further. Names were examined, backgrounds checked, service records reviewed. One name began to stand out, not because of obvious guilt, but because of subtle inconsistencies. A signal officer, experienced, competent, no history of misconduct. But there were gaps, transfers that didn't fully add up, a period of time where records were incomplete. Patton didn't jump to conclusions. He never did. But he trusted patterns. And this pattern pointed somewhere. The man was brought in quietly. No handcuffs, no accusations, just a request for questioning. He walked into the tent unaware of what was about to unfold. Patton was already there. You can imagine the silence in that room, the kind of silence that feels heavy. The officers stood at attention. Patton didn't immediately speak. He studied him. Every detail, every movement, every flicker of expression. Then came the questions. Simple at first. Routine. Where were you on this date? Who handled this communication? How was this message transmitted? The officer answered calmly, confidently. Too confidently, perhaps. Patton shifted slightly. He asked about the rerouted convoy. The officer hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough. In war, hesitation can be louder than words. The questioning became more direct. Patton's tone didn't rise. He didn't shout. That wasn't his style in moments like this. Instead, he pressed forward with precision, each question building on the last, each answer tightening the net. The officer's composure began to crack. At first it was small, a shift in posture, a slight delay in response. Then came contradictions, minor details that didn't align with earlier statements, and Patton noticed every single one. Outside, the wind continued to howl. Inside, the pressure grew. Finally, the officer broke. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden confession shouted across the room. It was quieter than that, a slow unraveling, a realization that the truth could no longer be hidden. He admitted to passing information, not directly to German officers, but through intermediaries, signals, encoded messages hidden within routine communications. It had started earlier than anyone suspected, months before the Ardennes offensive. The motive was complex, not just ideology, not just fear, a combination of factors, pressure, opportunity, and a belief, however misguided, that his actions could somehow shape the outcome of the war. Patton listened without interruption. When the confession ended, there was no immediate reaction, no outburst, just silence. Then Patton gave the order. The officer was to be detained immediately, held under guard, no contact with others. A full investigation would follow. Every message he had handled would be reviewed, every connection traced. But Patton didn't stop there. He understood that this wasn't just about one man. This was about restoring trust, about ensuring that nothing like this could happen again. Security protocols were tightened across the Third Army. Communication channels were restructured. Sensitive information was now distributed on a need-to-know basis only. Even senior officers found themselves with less access than before. Some didn't like it. War requires speed, and added layers of security can slow things down. But Patton didn't care. Speed means nothing if your enemy already knows your next move. And as these new measures took effect, something else began to surface. Small irregularities in past operations started to make more sense. Patrols that walked into ambushes, convoys that were shelled within minutes of moving, positions that were exposed just hours after being secured. It was like pieces of a puzzle finally locking into place. You can almost picture Patton revisiting those reports late at night, the lamplight flickering over stacks of paper, realizing how close some of those moments had come to disaster. How many lives had been risked because of one hidden leak? The deeper investigation revealed that the officer had not acted entirely alone in the beginning. There were indirect contacts, shadowy figures who passed along coded fragments of information through captured radio frequencies and manipulated transmissions. But as the war intensified, those connections faded, and the officer continued alone, believing he could still control the flow. That illusion of control had nearly cost the Third Army dearly. Patton ordered signal encryption methods to be changed immediately. Radio discipline became stricter. Operators were retrained under pressure, even in freezing conditions. You can almost feel those soldiers standing beside their equipment in the snow, fingers numb, repeating procedures again and again, knowing that one mistake could expose everything. At the same time, counterintelligence teams expanded their work. Background checks were no longer a one-time process, they became continuous. Officers were observed more closely, not with suspicion, but with awareness. War had entered a new phase where trust had to be earned again, every single day. Despite all this, Patton never allowed fear to take over command. He understood that an army cannot function if every man doubts the one next to him. So, while security tightened, leadership remained steady. Orders were clear. Confidence was maintained. And slowly, something changed. The enemy's advantage faded. German artillery no longer struck with the same precision. Their counterattacks seemed less coordinated. It was subtle at first, but undeniable. The invisible edge they had held was gone. The leak had been sealed. For the men on the ground, this meant something powerful. It meant that the strange, almost supernatural accuracy of enemy strikes had not been fate. It had been something human, something that could be stopped. Morale began to rise again. You can almost see it in the way soldiers moved, more certain, more focused. The fear of being unknowingly exposed began to fade, and in its place came renewed trust in their command. Patton addressed his officers shortly after, not with anger but with clarity. He spoke about discipline, about the unseen parts of responsibility, about the unseen parts of war that mattered just as much as tanks and guns. His words were simple, direct, and carried weight because every man in that room knew what had just been uncovered. And then, without dwelling on it, Patton moved forward. That was his way. By February 1945, the Third Army was pushing east, uncrossing the Sauer River and driving into German territory. Snow still covered the ground, but the momentum had shifted. German forces were retreating, their lines weakening under constant pressure. Yet, even in these moments of advance, Patton remained cautious in one specific way. Information flow was always controlled. Orders were still distributed carefully. Every operation was planned with the assumption that even the smallest leak could have consequences. You can almost feel the difference in his command style now, still aggressive, still fast, but sharper, more guarded. As the Third Army advanced through towns like Trier in early March, capturing key positions along the Moselle River, Patton's methods proved effective. The speed of the advance caught German forces off guard again, this time without any hidden advantage to help them. Then came one of the most critical moments. March 22, 1945, the Rhine River. For months, it had been a natural barrier, a line many believed would slow the Allied advance significantly. But Patton had other plans. Under cover of darkness, units of the Third Army began crossing near Oppenheim. Engineers worked silently, building pontoon bridges while artillery units provided cover. You can almost hear the quiet tension of that night, the sound of water moving beneath temporary bridges, the distant echo of gunfire, soldiers moving carefully, knowing that one mistake could expose the entire operation. But this time, there was no leak, no sudden artillery strike, no perfectly timed ambush. The crossing succeeded. By morning, American forces were firmly on the eastern bank of the Rhine. It was a turning point, and in a quiet way. It was also proof that the hidden threat had been removed, proof that when information was protected, the army could move with full strength. From there, the advance accelerated. Cities fell one after another. Resistance continued, but it was no longer coordinated in the same way. The war in Europe was entering its final phase. Yet, even as victory came closer, the memory of that winter investigation stayed with Patton. You can almost imagine him reflecting on it briefly, not in a dramatic way, but as a lesson. A reminder that leadership is not just about bold moves on the battlefield. It is also about recognizing the unseen dangers, the quiet threats that don't announce themselves with explosions, and, more importantly, having the discipline to act on instinct before it is too late. Because in that cold tent near Bastogne, there had been no clear proof at the beginning, only a feeling, a pattern that didn't make sense. Many might have ignored it. Patton didn't. And because of that, an entire army was protected from something that could have changed the course of multiple operations. By April 1945, the Third Army had advanced deep into Germany, liberating towns, securing supply routes, and capturing thousands of prisoners. The end of the war was no longer a question of if, but when. But even in those final days, the systems Patton had put in place remained. Information was guarded, trust was balanced with vigilance, and every officer understood why. Because once you've faced betrayal from within, you never forget it. You can almost feel that quiet understanding settling over the army, not fear, not suspicion, but awareness. The kind that stays with you long after the battle is over. The snow eventually melted, the war eventually ended, victory was achieved. But the memory of that hidden threat, the traitor within, remained a reminder of how fragile even the strongest systems can be. You can almost feel the weight of it, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet understanding, that sometimes the most dangerous battles are the ones fought in silence, inside a command tent, over a map, with questions that don't have easy answers, and decisions that must be made, no matter how difficult they are. Patton made those decisions, and history remembers not just the victories on the battlefield, but the moments behind the scenes that made those victories possible. Moments like this, cold, quiet, ruthless in their necessity. Because when the stakes are that high, there is no room for hesitation, only action.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.